Marina.
Hello, everybody, and happy Wednesday. Welcome to Link Live. My name is Marina Mayer, Editor-in-Chief of Food Logistics and Supply and Demand Chain Executive. And I'm here with my two lovely editors, if they want to go around the room and introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Brielle Jekyll. I'm the Associate Editor.
And I am Mackenna Morales, and I am the Assistant Editor.
And I'm excited because today we are accompanied by a wonderful guest, somebody who I consider to call a professional friend, Rebecca Brewster, President and COO of American Transportation Research Institute, and she's here to join us so that we can talk about driver shortage, the results from their annual driver report they just released a couple of months ago, the future of trucking and transportation, et cetera. So welcome, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me back on today.
Of course. A couple of housekeeping items before we move on. Go to foodlogistics.com and nominate those supply chain leaders in the cold food chain for our annual Rock Stars of the Supply Chain Award. You can also go to sdcexec.com to nominate those supply chain leaders in your organization for our annual Pros to Know Award. Both nominations close December 14th, right? We pushed the one back. So December 4th, not 14th. I'm giving my editors a heart attack. Okay. It's too early for that. December 4th. Okay. So back to the show. So the American Transportation Research Institute released new data about driver shortage and other trucking trends. You can go to our websites to find that. And I know, Rebecca, we talked earlier in the spring for our transportation chain series, and you mentioned something about how labor shortage during COVID was pretty much non-existent. Everything had kind of reversed. Fast forward to present day, what does that labor shortage look like today?
Wow, what a difference a few months makes, really and truly. When we last spoke, it was at sort of the height of the pandemic. We were all adjusting to what our life was going to look like. We became very adept subsequently at these Zoom type interviews. But because there was the pandemic had such an impact on freight demand, we really didn't see, and in many sectors of the industry, freight demand just dried up. If you think about it, all of us who drive cars were sheltering in place for the most part. And so demand for fuel went way down. And so therefore, tanker fleets that haul fuel, really their business, it didn't completely evaporate, but it certainly disappeared. However, on the flip side, if you were in consumer goods or foods, pharmaceuticals, your business was over the top because we were all, hoarding toilet paper and hand sanitizer and everything else early on. And so there was a real disconnect in how the initial impact of the pandemic was affecting the trucking industry. But through the course of the summer, and as we saw businesses start to reopen, freight demand continued to increase, and really and truly the driver shortage now is back almost to what we saw in 2018 when freight demand was really strong. And there are projections that it could continue to grow, obviously freight demand grow, but also that driver shortage, because over the course of these few months in the pandemic, we've had some other impacts on the driver supply that are making that capacity even tighter.
Wow. Brielle, you're on mute.
Whoops, sorry.
There we go. Yay. Okay, you had a question.
I want to know, what are some surprising trends that came from the report? Some things you either haven't seen in previous reports or that are completely different from previous reports.
So for your listeners, this is an annual survey that we do of the trucking industry at large, to identify the top issues of concern. So it is a ranking of the top 10 issues. And of course, driver shortage was the #1 issue for the 4th year in a row. And given when we launched this survey, which we do every year, we launched it in late August, early September. This year we put it out September 8th, and we knew freight demand was going up. It did not surprise me at all that the driver shortage was #1. Driver compensation, #2, very closely related issues. Truck parking, #3, its highest ranking yet on the survey, and clearly an issue that impacts our driver workforce on a daily basis. The #4 issue, and this was, to answer your question, the biggest surprise to me, the #4 issue was compliance, safety, accountability, or CSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's regulatory framework. And it's one of those issues in this annual survey that has really been very volatile. When we first got CSA, when FMCSA first deployed it in 2010, it came onto the survey as the #2 issue. It rose up to #1 as concerns with how motor carrier safety was being evaluated under the program were really at their height. And it stayed in the top 5 for several years. Then it dropped down into the bottom half, the lower 5, and it stayed there for a while. Last year it was #8. It's back up to #4. And that was such a surprise to me to see that big jump in it that I started to call some of the carriers who had ranked it as their #1 issue to really dive into why they were concerned about it. And there's a whole host of issues. There's challenges with their peer group ranking, so they don't believe they're being compared to other motor carriers who are like them in size and operation. There's concerns with how crashes are dealt with under the program. There are concerns with data that is in your record that doesn't belong to your fleet. It is incorrect data. And so a whole host of issues are driving that. So I would say that one was my biggest surprise. Probably #2 is the hours of service rules. And that's an issue that has been in the top 5 for a while. It dropped down from #2 last year to #10 this year. So a big drop, 8 spots. And quite frankly, I was surprised to see it still in the top 10 because with the latest changes we got this summer out of the agency, I believed that most of the concerns with the hours of service rules had been addressed. But there are still some concerns. It was higher on the driver ranking of issues. And so that still kept it in the list. So I would say probably CSA being #4 and hours of service still making the top 10 are my 2 biggest surprises.
When I first started writing for the magazine, so back in 2018, that was such a big deal, was the hours of service rules. And then ELDs was also just like a huge problem, or not so much a problem, but just like a pain point for most drivers. But how have those things and then the temporary closure of DMVs impacted the safety of drivers throughout COVID?
Well, first to ELDs and the hours of service. So I mentioned hours of service was higher on the driver list. And in fact, we report the overall findings of the industry concerns, but we also report the rankings as determined by motor carriers and separately by professional drivers. And so hours of service was higher on the driver list. You mentioned the ELD mandate. It also shows up on the driver's list of concerns. So there are still drivers who find the ELD mandate problematic. So those 2 issues, hours of service and ELD, have not disappeared. And of course, they're very closely related. And in fact, we broke out even among the driver population, the ranking between owner-operators and company drivers. And on the owner-operator side, the ELD mandate is their #3 issue. And so still concerned with that ELD mandate. Now, to the latter part of your question, which is how has the pandemic impacted the driver supply, and specifically the closing of truck driver training schools and state departments of DMVs where licenses are issued. And that has had an impact. Certainly when you shut down the credentialing system for people to come into the industry, so to get a commercial learner's permit or to get their CDL, that becomes problematic and creates a backlog for us. Combine that with the closing of schools, you really start to put a strain on the driver capacity. Now, both DMVs have begun to reopen, albeit at limited capacity, because now a driver has to make an appointment. You know, there aren't as many appointments. You can't just go and wait and sit there to get your license. And then the same thing on the school side. Because of the COVID protocols for social distancing, the school capacity is reduced. You can't have as many people in a classroom, and you have to have certain protocol in place when you put new candidates out on the road with a trainer. And so there's just a whole host of issues that are having additional impacts on the driver supply. The estimates are that we'll see a 40% drop in the number of new entrants this year because of those factors: schools shutting down and then coming back at reduced capacity, and licensing agencies shutting down and coming back at reduced capacity.
I also have another question. I'm sorry if I'm stepping
fine.
on any toes, but last summer there's a lot of rumors swirling around that the Trump administration was going to help reduce the mandatory rest breaks or completely eliminate them. How do you think that's going to play out now that the Joe Biden administration is coming in January?
Well, in fact, we did get a revised hours of service rules this summer out of FMCSA under the Trump administration that dealt with one of the bigger pain points that previous to this year's surveys had identified, and that was the lack of flexibility in the sleeper berth provision. And so this later rule allows for additional splitting of that time. Now you can do a 7 and 3 break as opposed to just an 8 and 2 hour break. We had done some previous research that looked at the potential savings for the industry and for drivers from additional flexibility, and the savings really did start to add up. And so I believe that that latest rule being put in place is another driver for why hours of service rules dropped down so much in the annual survey. You know, it will remain to be seen what happens under a new administration. But I think the experience of the industry under these hours of service rules has been good. And drivers, you know, at least anecdotally, what we hear from drivers is they appreciate that additional flexibility because it empowers them to make decisions about not sitting stuck in traffic. So if I'm coming into, for instance, where I live, if I'm coming into Atlanta and I know it's rush hour and I know I'm just going to be burning my hours of service sitting stuck in traffic, if I now have that additional flexibility to park and wait for the worst traffic to get through before I go through, that, you know, as a driver makes more sense to me, makes me feel like I'm more in charge of my own destiny, if you will. I get that rest and I reduce my frustration because I'm not sitting stuck in traffic. And so I think there are a lot of good outcomes that come from just allowing drivers to make better decisions about their own when they rest and when they are driving.
So I wanted to segue from the DMV training topic we covered. You know, I'm in Illinois and we are on lockdown. Our DMV is closed down till about, I think, beginning to mid-December. So we're kind of back to where we were in April. So what advice do you have for these companies who have to continuously pivot back and forth when it comes to the training and safety of their employees?
Well, it certainly is a challenge, particularly when you think about a CDL that is a state-issued credential. And, you know, if you're a fleet that operates in all 48 contiguous states and you've got drivers all over the country and their CDLs are coming up for renewal, you know, we know that FMCSA allowed for some extension of that because the DMVs were closed, but it is going to be a challenge for fleets as we continue to see more targeted closures in states or in areas where there are COVID hotspots. But in terms of keeping their workforce safe, I have to applaud the industry. Early on, they were pushing for essential worker status for professional drivers. And in fact, in one of the strategies in the Top Industry Issues report talks about advocating for making that essential worker status permanent. So for instance, when we think about a rollout of a vaccine for COVID-19, putting professional drivers in with first responders and medical workers, because certainly the pandemic showed us that we have to have those trucks keep moving so that we all can keep having what we need out of the supply chain.
That's a good point.
So how is the industry making trucking as a career more enticing?
Well, it's always been a challenge for us because this is not a career for everyone, particularly when you think about the over-the-road sector. And the pandemic has brought on some new challenges for us because you think about the dramatic increase in e-commerce because we're all sitting at home. We're bored, so we're shopping. So we're ordering more and more things online, even grocery delivery. So the competition for drivers is tougher than ever before because there are so many opportunities for drivers in those last mile deliveries that those are jobs where you're home every night. It's not as stressful as over the road. And so that's challenging for us as well. But how is the industry adapting to that? We have seen, even in our over-the-road fleets and the data that we've collected, a reduction in their average trip lengths because they are recognizing that that over the road, out for weeks at a time lifestyle is not appealing to everybody, and it's certainly not something that many of our younger individuals are geared for these days. And so they're readjusting their routes and their lanes of operation and how they deal with their customers and set up their contracts in a way that allows drivers to get home more frequently, because at home time, while driver compensation is important, and we saw driver compensation is the #2 issue on this year's survey, compensation is important, but those other factors like my ability to be at home more frequently are critically important. And I think the industry recognizes that and is adjusting to make the job more appealing.
Yeah, we've talked to several, 3PLs and carriers, and they all kind of voice the same challenges and concerns, and it is constant, and we feel it in the industry. So I applaud your organization for continuing to bring it top of mind, and hopefully more people will understand that, there's more to just trucking besides just driving the truck. There's more benefits to it. So,
well, and I think, the one of the silver linings of the pandemic is I do think people, the general public, is recognizing, one, how valuable and critical the trucking industry is. And when you think about the number of Americans who have become unemployed because of the pandemic, I believe people are seeing this is an industry that is sustainable. We don't shut down because there's a pandemic. Trucks keep rolling, and therefore everybody who works in the back office has to keep working in the trucking industry. So it is a sustainable, resilient career workplace. And I'm hopeful that that will resonate with folks as they look for ways to return to the workforce.
Yeah, I love that. So, obviously we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know when the post-COVID sector starts. We're kind of going into the second round of things, as we speak. We don't know what the winter is going to be like. What are your projections for, the next couple of months into even next year?
Well, certainly now we're coming upon the holiday season, which is typically a big time for freight as every one of us prepare for the holidays and start shopping even more. I think we'll continue to see that play out through e-commerce. And so freight demand will remain high. And I believe into 2021, particularly once a vaccine begins to be deployed and people get back to work, we'll probably see a little bit of a shift, because certainly if you were a fleet that provided freight for the services sector, your business has been down. So people who supply, sporting events and concerts and everything else, those things aren't happening. Large gathering events aren't happening. And so your business has shifted. As we all start to go back out to restaurants, that's going to change as well, because those who supplied schools, restaurants, other facilities, I think that business will start to return. And so I'm very hopeful for the trucking industry, that the business will certainly be there. It will just be a matter of, back to the #1 issue on the survey, can we find drivers to fill those seats?
And how does something like automation and all of these other technologies that are coming about, how does that play into, filling the gaps of the driver shortage?
Well, certainly the advanced driver assistive systems make the job of driving a truck easier. And if you get into the cab of a truck today, that a new off-the-line cab today versus one even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, it is a completely different vehicle, and it is much more like the cockpit of an airplane in terms of the technology. And I think that's going to also work in our favor in terms of attracting more younger people to the industry, because it really is cool to sit inside of a cab of a vehicle. And it just makes the job easier. I mean, you think even the advancements we all see in our cars that make safe driving easier, because now we have notification if there's somebody in the lane next to us. In some models of cars, and of course in trucks, you get that reduction in your speed if you're coming upon another vehicle too quickly. So there are features that are being added that just make the job of driving a truck easier and safer for you.
I agree. Well, I can't thank everybody enough out there who is continuing to drive and keep product moving. So thank you to all those essential employees, and thank you, Rebecca Brewster from American Transportation Research Institute, for joining us today and shedding some light on kind of what these challenges are, as well as what the opportunities are. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Just a reminder, we do not have a link live next week. I know everybody's going to lose some sleep over this, but it is Thanksgiving. And I do like to give my staff some time off. So we will not have one next week, but we will pick on up the week after, which is our SCN Summit Future of Supply Chains Week. So please register, go to foodlogistics.com, stcexec.com. So register, we're covering warehousing, transportation, supply chain visibility, procurement, and cannabis. So lots of great topics, lots of great speakers, lots of great content. I'm super, super excited. I'm always forgetting something. Download link, our podcast channel on Apple, Google Play, and Spotify. Woohoo, A for me, I remembered. What else am I forgetting, ladies?
Follow us on all of our social media
As always.
and still submit to the awards.
And still, which is December 4th.
4.
Right, what I said earlier, just ignore me half the time. So thank you again. Thank you, ladies. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Please stay safe, stay healthy, and support those essential employees. And happy Wednesday. We'll see you in a couple weeks.